Without a doubt, Venezuela is a socialist nightmare. It's indeed a vivid indictment of the economic system of socialism. It's appalling that a country like Venezuela, that sits atop more oil than Saudi Arabia, is in such a dire state that people actually eat their pets. No one disputes the disaster that is Venezuelan socialism. However, when it comes to regime change, the U.S. track record is less than stellar. It has been largely ignored that the possible replacement for Maduro, Guaido, is also a socialist. His political party is recognized by the Socialist International. My fear is that even if you get a kinder, gentler form of socialism, it's still socialism, and the results will be similar: economic malaise and economic disaster. What do you say as to replacing one socialist with another in Venezuela?
I don't think the main problem in Venezuela is that one party or another is a member of the Socialist International, which a lot of partners of ours in Europe are and have been. It's that it's a vicious, brutal, murderous dictatorship. And that's the real reason that we're engaged there. It has driven 5 million people out of the country.
But I guess that response sort of somehow alleviates the stigma of socialism from being a problem, that socialism isn't the problem there. And I guess many others who've watched socialism through the years have argued that you really can't have a kinder, gentler form of socialism, that what happens with democratic socialism is that when you want to have the state own the means of production, or when you want to have the state own property, that ultimately it devolves into a cronyistic system, that what Chavez and Maduro started out as is not what it ended up as. When you have a more complete form of socialism, as socialism evolves, that perhaps authoritarianism is a side effect of socialism. When Batista was rooted out, he was a so-called cronyist or whatever. There were people who supported Castro. Many well-intended people supported Castro in the beginning. And it turned out Castro wasn't any better than Batista, but was actually probably worse than Batista. So I think that we ought to be careful with this. And I think that discounting that socialism has anything to do with it is really discounting an economic nightmare that has happened in Venezuela and saying it's just because you got bad socialists. If we had better socialists, we wouldn't have so much of a problem. Do you think that the U.S. government has or the president has the right to militarily bring about regime change in Venezuela without the authority of Congress?
That's not our policy.
Do you think the president has the right to do that?
I think the president has the right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States under the Constitution, and we certainly would like to see a democratic Venezuela.
Sounds like a non-answer, but I mean, the question is, do you believe that the president has the right to do it without congressional authority? This is a very important constitutional question. Also, if the answer is that socialism's not the problem, we think one socialist is a little bit more benign than another socialist, and we think the president has the right to do it, we could very much be involved in this. And the reason why this is important and why the discussion of regime change is important is that President Trump gets it more than almost anybody else that the Iraq War, which I know you were a big proponent of, was an utter disaster. That in getting rid of one bad person, we were left with something maybe even worse, and that is the vacuum, the chaos, and the terrorism that comes from having no government. This happened again in Libya. So the real question of whether or not we want to always think we know what's best for another country and we're going to replace one leader with one less bad is an important one. Do you still believe that the Iraq War was something that you would support today? You still think the Iraq War was a good idea?
Senator, I haven't thought about the Iraq War in years because I'm in this job trying to deal with it.
Sounds like another non-answer, but it'd be nice to know if the president had people around him who actually agreed with him. The president thinks it's the worst public policy decision of the last generation, that it led to a vacuum, that actually led to chaos and more terrorism, but also led to more of the emboldenment of Iran. So the same hawks that wanted to go after Hussein now want to go after Iran, but now Iran is worse because Hussein is gone. So see, one thing leads to another, and there are unintended consequences. And I think the discussion of regime change is an important one, and I think we should not so casually dismiss socialism as being the problem in Venezuela.
Well, I'm not casually dismissing it, and I think that it is a very bad economic policy. But we've had allies. I mean, England has had socialist governments. France has had socialist governments. Germany has had socialist governments. They were allies of ours throughout the Cold War. That was not the problem as long as they were Democrats. Whether they pursue a terrible economic policy is essentially theirs to decide because it's their country. The problem with Venezuela is that it has a murderous, corrupt regime that is having an impact not only inside, but on all the neighbors.
And the question is whether murderous thugs are an accident of history or whether they are a consequence of socialism. Why does it seem that time in, time again, socialism leads to autocracy? And that is an important thing, because if you get a benign democratic socialism, how long does that last till it devolves into authoritarianism? I think it's a question worth asking.